On the afternoon of October 20th, 1968, on a small island in the Ionian Sea, a Greek Orthodox priest prepared a candlelit chapel for a wedding. The world's most photographed woman had told almost no one she was attending. The chapel was called the Panagitsa, the Chapel of the Little Holy Virgin. Rain came down over Skorpios that day. Outside the courtyard, roughly 50 journalists who had rowed across from a neighbouring island stood waiting in the wet for a glimpse of the bride. The ceremony began at 4 in the afternoon. 2 children carried the candles, a boy of 7 and a girl of 10, and they were the children of a murdered American president. The bride was Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, then 39 years old, and arguably the most admired woman in the world. This is the story of Aristotle Socrates Onassis, the Smyrna-born shipping magnate who built the largest privately held fleet on earth, ran his appetites the way a corporation runs its acquisitions, married the most admired woman in the world after the assassination of the only Kennedy capable of preventing it, kept a Paris mistress 2 streets from his marital apartment, and died in 1975, while his own lawyers were still drafting the divorce papers that would have humiliated his wife. Onassis was born in January of 1906 in the Karatash district of Smyrna, in what was then the Ottoman Empire. The exact day cannot be fixed because the records that would have settled it burned along with most of the city in 1922. The conventional date is January 20th. The destruction of the registries left enough room for argument that one historian has placed his birth as early as 1903, suggesting Onassis later shaved 3 years off to dodge a Turkish conscription draft. The Argentine passport he eventually carried gave yet another year and a different city of birth altogether. A man whose own birth date became negotiable is a useful thing to keep in mind when weighing everything that came after, because the habit of arranging the facts of his life to suit the moment began at the very beginning of it. His father, Socrates Onassis, was a tobacco merchant and banker counted among the wealthier men of the city, and the boy grew up in comfort that made what came next more brutal by contrast. The Karatash district in the early 20th century was one of the prosperous Greek neighbourhoods of a city whose Greek population traced its presence on the Aegean coast back to antiquity. The Onassis household was Orthodox Christian, commercially established and securely positioned within a Greek community whose existence in Smyrna seemed by every appearance permanent. That appearance vanished in a single September. He was 16 years old in September of 1922 when the Turkish army entered Smyrna and the fire began. From the deck of a ship in the harbour he watched his birthplace burn. The family fortune was destroyed. 3 uncles and an aunt were among the dead. His father was imprisoned and sentenced to death. What the boy did to free him became the story Onassis would, decades later, tell to the journalist Peter Evans, whom he had personally summoned to write his life. According to that account, the teenager entered into a sexual relationship with an older Turkish lieutenant, and that relationship secured his father's release and the recovery of some of the family's seized holdings. The story cannot be independently confirmed. It rests on what Onassis himself chose to disclose to a single chronicler. Evans, who spent 9 months in close conversation with him, would later call Onassis a monster. What matters is not whether every detail of the disclosure is true. What matters is what the man believed the episode had taught him, that intimacy was a thing you spent, like cargo, to buy passage out of a burning place. The lesson he carried out of Smyrna would govern the rest of his dealings with the rest of the world. The man who walked into the Panagitsa chapel in 1968 had spent people for nearly half a century by then. He had simply grown rich enough that the currency no longer ran out. The boy from the Karatash district had turned a single catastrophe into a working theory of human relations, and he never revised it. Every later relationship in his life would be measured against the lesson he had learned at 16 on the bridge of a ship. He had watched his city burn from the deck of a ship arranged for him by what he proved willing to do for an older Turkish lieutenant. People could be spent. The proposition simplified everything that followed in the life of Aristotle Onassis. In August of 1923, Aristotle Onassis sailed for Argentina on a Nansen passport, the document issued to stateless refugees, with somewhere between $60 and $250 in his pocket, depending on which account you trust. He took night work as a switchboard operator in Buenos Aires. He ran a tobacco importing business during the day, drawing on the connections that survived from his father's old trade. Within 6 years of his arrival, he held Argentine citizenship. Not long after, he held his first $1 million in capital, the first of many such milestones he would treat as ordinary commercial markers. In 1932, while the Great Depression had collapsed the price of ships to a fraction of their worth, he bought his first 6 freight vessels. The stories behind figures like Aristotle Onassis, the empire he built across 3 continents, and the women he drew into it receive extended treatment in our free Substack newsletter, where the personal and financial wreckage, too complex for documentary format, reveals what these lives actually cost the people who lived them. The Onassis saga belongs in that company. From freighters he moved into oil tankers, building progressively larger ones until, in 1954 alone, he commissioned 17 supertankers at once. Roughly 2 decades after stepping off the boat in Buenos Aires, he owned the largest privately held shipping fleet on Earth. A fleet, several writers, compared to a national navy. The methods that built it did not stay clean, and the United States government eventually made that a matter of public record. The investigation that produced the settlement began in 1950, when CIA agents working from photographic evidence determined that New York-based Greek shipping magnates were carrying cargo on American-built vessels not only for the United States and its allies, but also for North Korea and China. The Korean War was at its bloodiest stage. The intelligence opened an investigation. The charge that resulted was narrower and more technical: conspiracy to defraud the United States in the fraudulent acquisition of 23 surplus American vessels under a 1946 law that forbade non-citizen control of vessels flying the American flag. In December of 1955, Onassis consented to pay $7 million in penalties. Criminal fines of $160,000 were levied against 6 of his corporations, all of which admitted guilt. Onassis himself walked away without a conviction on his own name, the formal stain absorbed by the corporate entities he controlled. The distinction mattered to him and to no one else. It became the template for how he would conduct himself for the rest of his life, placing the liability on the structure and keeping the man clean. The corporate vehicles he used were registered across 6 jurisdictions: Panama, Liberia, Argentina, Greece, each chosen to take advantage of a particular tax or regulatory exemption. The man on his Argentine passport, on his Greek shipping registrations, and on his Liberian flag of convenience filings was, depending on which document you consulted, 3 different versions of the same person. The $7 million penalty, enormous for its day, functioned for him the way a parking fine functions for an ordinary man. He had learned in Smyrna that the world could be bought out of. The Justice Department had just confirmed the lesson at scale. The man who emerged from the 1955 settlement was wealthier than the man who entered it. The $7 million penalty had not slowed the fleet. The tanker contracts had not been cancelled. The countries he transported oil for continued to do so. What he now needed was a stage worthy of the man he believed himself to be. He named his yacht the Christina O after his daughter, and turned it into a 500-foot advertisement for what unlimited money could purchase when restraint was no longer a consideration. The vessel was originally HMCS Stormont, a Canadian frigate that had escorted Atlantic convoys during the Second World War for the Royal Canadian Navy. Onassis acquired her in the early 1950s for what amounted to a salvage price. The reconstruction took 4 years and millions of dollars. This was a moment when most yacht owners measured their private vessels in tens of meters. The Christina O ran to roughly 150 meters. She carried a crew of more than 50, which made her, in operational terms, less a yacht than a small ship operating under private flag. The crew lived aboard year-round when the owner was travelling, which he did relentlessly. The guests who passed through were the names of the era, and the names became the trophy in the way the trophies in his father's tobacco house had once been products. The interior took years and a small fortune to finish. There was a swimming pool whose mosaic floor rose on hydraulics to become a dance floor. There were taps that ran salt water and fresh. There was a surgery. There was a bar he called Ari's Bar, whose footrests were made from the teeth of sperm whales. The bar stools were upholstered in leather tanned from the foreskins of whales. The interior was decorated by a team of European designers, but the most distinctive details were Onassis's own contributions. The bar stools were one of those. Some of those whales had come from his own whaling operation, which in November of 1954 was intercepted by the Peruvian Navy for hunting inside the waters Peru claimed as its own. A Peruvian naval court fined him $3 million on the 30th of that month. The whaling fleet had operated on the same logic as everything else he did, sailing into waters another nation claimed, and taking what it wanted until a navy stopped it. The Peruvian fine, like the American settlement a year later, was simply a cost of doing business, as he chose to do it. He had hunted the whales, he had skinned them, and he had upholstered his furniture in the most intimate part of their anatomy. Then he had built a comic routine around making his guests sit on it. The bar stools generated the line for which the yacht is best remembered. He would seat a female guest, a Greta Garbo or a Grace Kelly, and inform her that she was sitting on the largest penis in the world. No single book or contemporaneous interview has ever been located that first printed the words. The quote migrated into yacht travel journalism the way such things do, repeated until repetition became evidence. It survives because it is exactly the sort of thing the documented facts about the man make plausible. The joke of a man who has decided that other people exist primarily for his entertainment. The yacht functioned as a stage, and everyone who walked onto it became a prop in an ongoing performance about Aristotle Onassis. The yacht was where Aristotle Onassis became most thoroughly himself, surrounded by guests whose presence depended on his hospitality. Tolerance for his behaviour was bought by the same fact. A man can show you what he actually values if you give him an unlimited budget and no audience capable of objection. And Onassis showed it. The Christina O would soon host the cruise that ended 2 marriages in a single Mediterranean summer. On December 28, 1946, Onassis married Athena Livanos, called Tina, the 17-year-old daughter of the shipping magnate Stavros Livanos. The groom was 40. The match was, by every account, a dynastic shipping alliance. The marriage 2 Greek shipping families arrange for the same reason royal houses once arranged theirs. The couple had 2 children, Alexander in 1948 and Christina in 1950. For a decade, the marriage held the shape the alliance had required. Then, on September 3, 1957, at a party given in her honour in Venice by the American hostess Elsa Maxwell, Onassis met the soprano Maria Callas, the most celebrated opera singer of her generation. Callas was at the time married to the Italian industrialist Giovanni Battista Meneghini. He remarked afterward on the natural curiosity between them, the 2 most famous Greeks alive in the world. Within 2 years, that curiosity had become the central fact of 4 lives. In the summer of 1959, Onassis arranged a Mediterranean cruise aboard the Christina O. On July 22nd, the guests gathered at Monaco, among them Sir Winston Churchill, Maria Callas, and her husband Meneghini, and Onassis's wife Tina. The cruise was, by every contemporaneous account, where the affair began. His obituary in the Times later recorded the arc with unusual precision. By the time the cruise began, the gossip columns had started linking Onassis and Callas, and by the time it ended, it was evident both the Onassis marriage and the Meneghini marriage would also end. Within weeks, Callas had separated from Meneghini. The following June, Tina filed for divorce in New York, citing adultery with a woman she identified only as J.R., to avoid placing Callus's name in the public record. The divorce was finalised in June of 1960. What Callus gave up to be near Onassis was more than a husband. She was, before Onassis, the most disciplined artist in opera, a woman whose voice was the product of relentless work. The years with him saw that voice decline as her life reorganised itself around a man who treated her presence as a convenience instead of a vocation. The relationship never carried her toward the thing she wanted, which was marriage and a child. It carried her instead steadily away from the stage that had made her. The discipline that had produced the voice required the life Callus had lived before Onassis: rehearsal, isolation, a calendar built around performance dates. Life with Onassis was nightclubs in Monte Carlo, and dinners on the Christina O, and travel arranged around his schedule rather than hers. By the early 1960s, the voice that had defined the operatic stage for a decade was audibly thinner. The decline was not steady. It was the erosion that becomes obvious in one performance and then reverses, then returns, the unstable arc of a singer whose instrument depends on conditions she is no longer in control of. Critics, who had once called Callus the greatest singer of her generation, began writing about a decline whose causes they could only guess at. The most likely cause was sitting in the front row at most of her remaining performances. Onassis had taken her out of the rehearsal calendar her voice required, and the voice was responding to the change in her circumstances by losing exactly the qualities her audience had paid to hear. She would still be near him, 2 streets from his deathbed, 16 years after the cruise that began everything. The first Mrs. Onassis would die in Paris in 1974 of a barbiturate overdose, the first of the women in this story to be destroyed by proximity to him. Before there was Jackie, there was her sister. Through the early 1960s, while Jacqueline Kennedy was First Lady of the United States, Onassis was conducting an affair with her younger sister, Caroline Lee Bouvier, by then Princess Lee Radziwill, a prominent socialite married to a Polish prince. The relationship is established in Peter Evans's reporting and corroborated across multiple accounts. It placed Onassis inside the orbit of the Kennedy family by way of the First Lady's own sister, a position that the President's brother regarded as intolerable. According to Evans, Robert Kennedy, then Attorney General, was furious enough at Onassis's proximity to the White House and to both Bouvier sisters that he instructed Jackie to tell her Greek boyfriend he would not be coming back until Jack was re-elected. A long time after, like maybe never. The quotation rests entirely on Evans's reporting in his 2004 book Nemesis, and has never been corroborated by any independent document, witness, or recording. It is consistent with the documented hostility between the two men, but its provenance is a single secondary source and should be weighed as such. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The state funeral was held 3 days later. Onassis was in Washington that night. The most detailed recent account, from the biographer J. Randy Taraborelli, has Onassis telephoning Jackie to say he was in town and staying at a hotel, after which she felt she had no choice but to invite him to the White House, where he was put up in the spare quarters of a staff member. A more widely circulated version holds that Lee extended the invitation on Jackie's behalf, because Jackie could not be seen to invite him herself. Either way, Onassis was among only a handful of people accommodated at the White House for the funeral period. He had not been invited to Arlington. He did not attend the service. He remained in the nearly empty house while the nation buried its president, and he was afterward invited into the widow's private quarters. In the years after Dallas, there was also money moving in Jackie's direction, though the evidence has to be weighed rather than swallowed. Peter Evans reports in Nemesis that Jackie, under financial pressure as a widow, took cash from Onassis in envelopes, as much as $100,000 a year, a specific mechanism that rests on Evans alone and has no documentary corroboration. The surrounding facts are firmer than the figure. A congressional widow's pension and the income from her late husband's estate were real but limited. the costs of the life Jackie was expected to maintain were not, and historians who have studied the period accept that a generous allowance from Onassis would have been welcome by 1968. The image that closes the chapter is that of a man positioned at the exact centre of a national grief by his usefulness instead of his welcome. He had served as the sister's lover and was tolerated as the widow's guest. He was present in the house on the night of the funeral, not because anyone wanted him there, but because he had made himself, as he always did, the person with the resources a grieving woman needed. The arrangement was, in its own way, the Smyrna lesson scaled to its largest application. The Smyrna lesson held, he had spent his way into the room. He had spent his way out of every other room since 1922, and the lesson had outlived the city that taught it to him. The most lurid claim attached to these years is that Jackie and Robert Kennedy themselves became lovers. It must be handled with the care the evidence demands, because its principal source is a writer whose entire body of work has been discredited. C. David Heyman, in his 2009 book Bobby and Jackie, A Love Story, alleged a 4-year affair beginning in late 1963 and lasting until Bobby entered the 1968 presidential race. He cited named figures including Pierre Salinger, Gore Vidal, Truman Capote, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Heyman's reliability collapsed under examination. A 2014 Newsweek investigation by David K. Johnston concluded his biographies were riddled with errors and fabrications. NPR issued a public correction in 2015 after relying on one of his books. The writer John Dean stated flatly that Heyman was a fraud. Any claim that rests on Heyman alone cannot be presented as fact, and several of the most cinematic details in this part of the story rest on Heyman alone. One scene illustrates the problem with precision. On May 27, 1964, 2 days before what would have been the late president's 47th birthday, the family and some friends gathered for a dinner cruise aboard the presidential yacht Sequoia. Arthur Schlesinger was among them, a detail confirmed in his own record and by a guest's later account. Heyman's book has Bobby and Jackie disappearing below deck while Ethel stayed above, and quotes Schlesinger, describing them on their return as looking as chummy and relaxed as a pair of Cheshire cats. The cruise is real. The quotation, attributed to Schlesinger, does not appear in the authoritative published edition of his journals that his sons edited from the 6,000-page archive. There is no way to verify it against the manuscript without the access Heyman claimed to have had. The same applies to the Onassis remark Heyman reports, that he could bury that sucker, although he would lose Jackie in the process. It is sourced to an unnamed informant in a discredited book. The pattern repeats across the sensational claims. A named and credible figure is invoked, a vivid scene is constructed, and the verification turns out to be impossible because the only road to it runs through a writer the journalistic record has demolished. What can be said responsibly is narrower and therefore more useful. A Bobby and Jackie relationship of unusual closeness was also alleged independently by the British biographer Sarah Bradford in her 2000 book America's Queen, drawing on her own unnamed sources, which lends the general thesis some weight that Heyman's catalogue does not. Kennedy family members have denied it, and Robert Kennedy Jr. called the claims a total exaggeration. The honest verdict is that the closeness is plausible, and the individual scenes are unproven, and a story this consequential deserves to be told without borrowing certainty it has not earned. The honest summary of the evidence is that Bobby and Jackie shared a deep relationship of some kind, that the romantic claims rest largely on a fabulist's book, and that the truthful version cannot be reconstructed from the available sources. What that available evidence does confirm is that Onassis hated the proximity, that the Kennedy family hated his proximity, and that the hatred between Onassis and Robert Kennedy was real enough to leave traces in the public record on both sides. What can be said with certainty is what happened next. Whatever the truth of the relationship between Jackie and Robert Kennedy, the man who reportedly swore the marriage to Onassis would happen over his dead body was about to walk into a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles. On June 5, 1968, in the kitchen corridor of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, moments after a victory speech in the California Democratic primary, Robert Kennedy was shot by Sirhan Sirhan. He died the following day. He was 42 years old. Whatever the truth of his relationship with Jackie, his death removed the one Kennedy still standing between her and Aristotle Onassis. 4.5 months later, on October 20, 1968, she married Onassis on Skorpios. The interval is the chapter's whole argument, and the people around Jackie understood it as such. Jackie made the decision in such secrecy that she told no one, not even her sister. Lee learned of the engagement not from Jackie but from Onassis himself, who telephoned her while she was on holiday in Tunisia. The call was made to extend a personal invitation and, by several accounts, to beg Lee to attend. Lee had served as his lover. Now Onassis was asking her to stand at the wedding of her sister to the man. A distraught Lee called Truman Capote to report what she considered a betrayal beyond imagination. She came anyway. She arrived in time to be part of the wedding party, present at Aristotle's invitation, not her sister's. The speed of the thing unsettled even the people closest to Jackie. Capote, to whom Lee carried her grief, would become the keeper of the sister's wound. The rupture between Jackie and Lee that opened that autumn never fully closed. The woman who had stood as matron of honour at a wedding she learned of from the groom carried the slight for the rest of her life. There is a competing account in which Lee did not attend at all and sent only a telegram. The photographic record of Lee and her daughter arriving in Athens en route to Skorpios on the day of the wedding, along with the corroboration of the major biographers, settles the matter in favour of attendance. She was there in the small rain-soaked chapel, standing up for the marriage of her sister to the man who had served as her own lover. Onassis had begged her to come by that man personally, while her sister said nothing to her at all. The arithmetic of that betrayal would be settled decades later, and it was settled coldly. When Jackie died in 1994, her will contained a single sentence concerning the sister who had served as her matron of honour, stating that she had made no provision for Lee because she had already done so during her lifetime, a sentence that left Lee nothing while establishing trusts for Lee's children. The bride, who had told no one, had made her own arrangements about who would be informed and who would be excluded in the engagement and in the will alike, and the symmetry between the two silences belongs to a careful life conducted on purpose. The Skorpios' wedding itself was small, intimate, and almost entirely staged for the benefit of the people who were not invited. The journalists who had rowed across in the rain to stand outside the courtyard were the audience the ceremony was designed to keep at a distance. The hush around the wedding was its own message. The most famous American widow had chosen, and the choice was nobody's business but hers. What Jackie was walking into on Skorpios was a contract her own brother-in-law had helped negotiate. The figure that everyone remembers, 170 clauses, originates with a single named and interested witness. Christian Kafarakis was a former chief steward on the Christina, who sold his disclosures to a London newspaper in 1971. Jackie's office promptly contradicted Kafarakis, with her assistant, Nancy Tuckerman, calling the contract entirely fabricated and absurd. The number itself cannot be confirmed. Later, retellings inflated it to 173 or to nearly 200. What can be confirmed is that a formal prenuptial instrument existed. The authenticated settlement document later sold at auction, signed by Jackie and by Christina Onassis, refers directly to the original agreement made upon the marriage. The instrument was real, even if its specific contents remain a matter of competing claims. The clauses everyone quotes, then, are a steward's account. The existence of the bargain is a matter of record. The negotiation behind it was conducted by professionals on both sides. Ted Kennedy, Jackie's brother-in-law, opened on her behalf and was prepared to accept around $1.5 million. Jackie's stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss, urged her to demand more, and the matter passed to André Meyer, the Lazard Frères banker the Kennedys trusted. Meyer was outraged at the opening figure and pushed it upward, reportedly floating $20 million before Onassis warned that his client could price herself out of the market. The authenticated document confirms $2 million paid at the marriage, not the $3 million some biographers cite. The steward's disclosures describe the rest in detail. Monthly cash for personal expenses, separate bedrooms in each of the couple's 6 residences, trust funds for her 2 children with the annual interest paid to her, and an annual outlay for what Kafarakis called her safety and pleasure that included a budget for round-the-clock bodyguards. The divorce trigger was set at roughly $17 million should Onassis end the marriage. The figure that explains the bargain is the one Greek law would have produced automatically. Under Greek forced heirship rules in 1968, a widow was entitled to a fixed share of her husband's estate, 1/8 of it. On a fortune later valued near $500 million, that share would have come to roughly $62 million on his death. By signing the contract, Jackie traded the larger automatic inheritance for guaranteed cash now and a capped figure later. She was buying security at a discount, exchanging an uncertain widow's fortune for certain monthly income. The trade made sense for a woman who had already watched, from a passenger seat in Dallas, how quickly fortune can be converted to widowhood. She was doing it with the cold competence of a woman who had already watched one fortune evaporate in Dallas. The competing dollar figures in the various accounts are worth pausing on, because they show how a contested document acquires false precision through retelling. The first year's spending has been reported variously at $580,000 and at $1.5 million. The journalist Fred Sparks calculated the couple's combined outlay at an average of more than $380,000 a week, the basis for the title of his book, The $20 Million Honeymoon. None of these numbers can be reconciled to the dollar because the underlying contract has never been published in full. What survives instead is a cloud of figures orbiting a document that the people involved confirmed existed and refused to release. The pattern of the contested numbers is itself the story. A document this consequential, signed by parties this famous, exists in popular memory as a list of clauses, rather than as a legal instrument anyone has actually read. What the contract did not buy her was the one thing the marriage advertised itself as providing. The contract bought Jackie a title and an income. It did not buy her the man's attention, because that attention had belonged elsewhere since 1959. Onassis kept his apartment at 88 Avenue Foch, in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. Maria Callas kept hers a short distance away at 36 Avenue Georges Mandel. According to his personal secretary Kiki Moutsatsos, the two of them never stopped seeing each other after the affair began, because they could not live without each other. Moutsatsos described the open secret of the household in an interview published by People in December of 2024. When she telephoned the staff in Athens or Paris each morning, they would tell her, half joking, that Mr. Onassis was very, very tired. When she asked why, they would say that Maria had visited overnight. Everyone in the house knew. Jackie knew. Jackie complained to Onassis's sister Artemis, who advised her not to fight, but to ignore it. Moutsatsos said Jackie behaved like a cat, very smart, very clever, waiting for the right moment to raise his behaviour with him. The cruelty inside the household went past infidelity. The most serious allegations concern the medical staff Onassis kept. The biographer Ariana Stasinopoulos reported in her 1981 Life of Callas, drawing on more than 2,000 of the singer's letters to her godfather and on extensive interviews, that Callas underwent an abortion in 1966 at Onassis's insistence. He had told her he would end the relationship if she kept the child, and he had already determined to marry Mrs. Kennedy as the ultimate prize in his pursuit of prestige. Major American papers reported the claim in February and March of that year. A competing account from the biographer Nicholas Gage, alleging a 1960 live birth, has been rejected by scholarly consensus as resting on forged hospital records. More disturbing still, Lindsay Spence's 2021 biography Cast a Diver, built on previously unseen archives at Stanford, alleges that Onassis kept an abortionist among his personal staff. According to Spence, the doctor was used not only on Callus, but on his first wife Tina, and when she became pregnant at 19, on his own daughter Christina. The geography of the arrangement was its own quiet cruelty. The two apartments sat in the same fashionable arrondissement, close enough that a man could leave one in the evening and reach the other on foot. According to Moutsatsos, that is exactly what Onassis did on the nights the staff reported him too tired to take a call. Jackie occupied the residence with the title and the contract. Callus occupied the one with the man, in an arrangement that the staff in both apartments understood from the first week of the marriage. The wife who had negotiated separate bedrooms into her marriage found that the clause she had insisted upon was redundant, because the bedroom that mattered was in another building entirely. The advice she received from her husband's own sister was to treat the whole thing as beneath her notice. She did in public. She complained only in private, and only to a small number of confidants who could be trusted to keep what she said. The public Jackie remained, throughout the marriage, exactly the figure the cameras had captured at the wedding chapel, an unflinching woman moving through her circumstances with absolute control of her own face. What she could not prevent was the conversion of her humiliation into a matter of public consumption, on the one piece of ground she had assumed was wholly private. In the summers of the early 1970s, a team of as many as 10 photographers conducted a covert operation against Jackie on Skorpios. The scope of it is worth stating plainly. According to the contemporaneous American press account of late November 1972, the magazine that printed the pictures claimed the photographers had pursued Jackie since January of 1971, a campaign of roughly a year and a half. They worked from motorboats and wore aqualungs and carried underwater cameras so they could surface near a shoreline she believed no lens could reach. They treated her body as a commodity to be harvested on the one piece of ground on Earth she had assumed was wholly private. The images of Jackie sunbathing and walking nude ran first across 9 pages of the Rome men's magazine Playman in November of 1972. The page count itself, reported by the New York Times at the time, not inflated by later retelling. 3 years later, the American publisher Larry Flint bought the American rights for $18,000 and ran several of them, 4 of them full page, in the August 1975 issue of Hustler. He ordered a print run far larger than the magazine's norm, and the gamble paid out completely. The issue sold out within days, sales leaping from a few thousand copies to over 2 million. The photographs launched Flint's publishing empire, and he would later call the purchase the wisest investment of his life. What turns a violation into something darker is the identity of the person who, by one account, arranged it. Christopher Anderson's 2014 biography The Good Son names Onassis himself as the source who set the photographers loose. Anderson writes that in November of 1972, 10 photographers put on wetsuits and slipped into the waters off Skorpios, and that the detailed maps of the island and the dates, times and places where Jackie was expected to be were all provided by Ari. In Anderson's verbatim telling, Onassis was fed up with financing his wife's invasion of privacy lawsuits and hatched a plan to embarrass Jackie so completely that there would be nothing more the press could do to hurt her, while also wounding the woman he kept deriding as the widow. The photographers, working from the maps and the schedule he supplied, snapped scores of colour photos of her. Anderson's claim is contested. The daughter of one of the photographers has disputed it, insisting her father acted alone. The photographer Settimio Garitano acknowledged only that an Olympic Airways employee tipped him off, never confirming that Onassis gave the order. What Jackie did in response measures the helplessness of her position. She had pursued invasion of privacy litigation before. The very lawsuits Anderson says her husband refused to keep funding, but against images already printed and sold across 2 countries, there was no court that could call the pictures back. The most photographed woman of her century absorbed the exposure in public silence. Strip away the period vocabulary about scandal and skin magazines, and what remains is the non-consensual distribution of intimate images of a woman who had no means to prevent it, sold for profit, and, if Anderson is right, engineered by her own husband to break her. The hustler payout to the photographers and to the agents who had brokered the images was, in its own way, the final invoice from the operation. The pictures functioned as a financial transaction at every stage, and the woman in them had received nothing from any of the parties profiting from her exposure. The campaign to break her would continue until grief broke her husband first. On January 22nd, 1973, Alexander Onassis, his only son and the heir for whom he built everything, was a passenger in a small amphibious plane that crashed on takeoff at Hellinikon Airport in Athens. He died of his injuries the following day at the age of 24. The loss broke something in Onassis that no fortune could repair. He turned the grief outward onto his wife. He began in private to call Jackie the witch. He told his closest associates that she carried a curse, reasoning with the bleak superstition of a wrecked man. The first important man in her life died, then the second, and now his own son died while she was Mrs. Onassis. His daughter, Christina, who had called Jackie the gold digger from the start, fed the belief. The brother she lost once put it most plainly: "My father loved the names, and Jackie loved the money." In the year that followed, Onassis set about ending the marriage with deliberate cruelty. He engaged the lawyer Roy Cohn in 1974 to begin drafting divorce proceedings, a fact Cohn confirmed to the New York Times in 1981, which makes it one of the few claims in this whole account corroborated by the person directly involved. Stassinopoulos reported that Onassis hired a private detective to follow Jackie and produce evidence of adultery, and that he decided to divorce her, but only after he had made it as humiliating as possible for her, a phrase the United Press International wire quoted directly from the book. The ground for the campaign of cruelty was laid years earlier, in February of 1970, when 4 of Jackie's personal letters to Roswell Gilpatrick surfaced at a Manhattan autograph dealer's shop and were reported by Time magazine. The embarrassment had arrived during her marriage, and her husband would not let her forget it. The household around Onassis was emptying out as well, and each loss seemed to confirm the superstition he had fastened onto his wife. His first wife, Tina, the mother of the son he had just buried, died in Paris in October of 1974 of a barbiturate overdose, a year and 9 months after Alexander's crash. Christina, who had loathed Jackie from the wedding and called her the gold digger and worse, hardened into the chief prosecutor of the curse theory. She told her father that the American woman had brought the family its bad luck. The conviction grief had already half formed in Onassis was reinforced by the daughter most invested in seeing the wife removed. Onassis had spent decades absorbing people into his orbit, and the orbit was now visibly collapsing inward upon the man at its centre. Instead of examining the appetites that had drawn them all toward him, he looked for a single cursed figure to blame, and he found her in the bedroom down the hall that the contract had guaranteed would stay separate from his. His body was failing as fast as the marriage. He suffered from myasthenia gravis, the autoimmune disease that strips the muscles of their ability to obey. In his final months he appeared in public with his eyelids held open by strips of adhesive tape, because he could no longer raise them himself. A man who had spent his life arranging how others would be seen had lost command of his own face. The Cohn engagement was concrete enough that papers existed, and those papers would later end up in the hands of Constantine Gratsos, the closest of Onassis's associates. He spent that final terrible year trying to arrange one last humiliation for the wife he had bought and come to hate. Onassis died on March 15, 1975, at the American Hospital of Paris, of bronchial pneumonia brought on by the myasthenia gravis. He died before the divorce he had set in motion could be filed, and so Jackie remained, technically, his widow. His will was the last instrument of the campaign he had not lived to finish. He left 55% of the fortune to his daughter Christina and 45% to the foundation bearing his dead son's name. He wrote his widow down to the smallest sum a Greek widow could be given, which insiders put at around $3 million. Christina, who had wanted Jackie gone since the wedding, pressed the advantage, and the two women fought through lawyers for 2 years. A settlement gave Jackie roughly $26 million in exchange for waiving every further claim. The figure was less a victory than a withdrawal, the price at which she agreed to stop being an Onassis in everything but the name she would keep. She passed the money on to Maurice Tempelsman, the Belgian-American diamond dealer who would become the companion of her later life. Over the following decade, Tempelsman quadrupled it. There was a coda in the apartment on Avenue Georges Mandel. Maria Callas had reached Onassis in his hospital room, by one account reaching him through a service elevator while he lay in a coma. He kept her red Hermes blanket near him at the end. 2.5 years after he died, on September 16, 1977, Callas died of a heart attack in that apartment at the age of 53. She spent her last reclusive years on the sedatives her biographers describe and the isolation they all confirm. According to Stasinopoulos, sourcing the claim to Onassis's closest associate, Konstantin Gratsos, who had the unfiled divorce papers in his possession, Onassis had said in his final months that Maria was the true love of his life. He had said that marrying Jackie was his life's supreme act of betrayal of her. He had said that he was preparing to leave Jackie and return to Maria at the moment when his own body failed him. Set beside all of that, Jackie's own public statement on his death reads like a document drafted by a lawyer. She said that Aristotle Onassis had rescued her at a moment when her life was engulfed with shadows, that they had lived through many beautiful experiences together, and that she would be eternally grateful. Not a word about love, not a mention of grief, not a syllable that could be quoted against her by anyone reading the statement carefully. The widow had given the public an instrument crafted with the same care her late husband had once brought to her prenuptial contract. The verbs are the verbs of a rescue and a transaction, gratitude, not loss, and the woman who chose them had chosen every word she gave the public for 30 years. The same publicly composed widow who had stood in the rain at the Panagitsa chapel walked out of the funeral parlour in 1975 with a settlement to negotiate, a sister to reconcile with or not, and a 30-year second act to live. Jackie lived on with Tempelsman moving into her Fifth Avenue apartment in 1988, though he never divorced the wife he had separated from years before. She was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in the winter of 1993, and she died on May 19, 1994. In her last months, she burned her own letters and photographs by her own hand. A friend once said Jackie kept 3 lives, a public one, a private one, and a secret one. The burning was the final editorial act of a woman who had spent her life deciding what others would be allowed to know. She made sure that only the first survived her, that the discreet erasure she performed in her final months matched the discretion she had carried through every other decade of her existence as a public figure. The man who had spent his life arranging what other people would be allowed to see had been outlasted, in the end, by a woman whose discretion was the equal of his appetites.